My name's Cassandra Whitlow. I'm 28, and I want to start with the exact sentence that made me realize something was very wrong, because it came from someone who genuinely wasn't supposed to be the one telling me any of this. Man, your parents really came through for the open bar. That thing must have run them what? $6 grand? Your brother's lucky. That was Palmer, my brother Theo's best man, standing next to me at the wedding reception with a drink in his hand, clearly just making friendly small talk. No idea whatsoever that he was about to blow open something my parents had spent almost a year carefully hiding from me, because I knew, for a fact, that my parents didn't have $6,000 extra sitting around for an open bar, not because they were broke, exactly, but because 11 months earlier, they'd told me, very specifically, that they simply couldn't help me anymore with the emergency fund we'd been building together after I lost almost everything in a house fire. Okay, let me back up, because that sentence alone doesn't explain enough yet. 14 months before that wedding, an electrical fire tore through my rental duplex outside Columbus, Ohio, in the middle of the night. I got out safely, thank God, along with my cat, but I lost nearly everything else. Furniture, clothes, my laptop, years of photos I hadn't backed up properly, all of it gone in about 20 minutes. My renter's insurance covered some of it, but nowhere near enough to actually rebuild a life from scratch, especially once I factored in the security deposit and first month's rent for a new place. On top of replacing basic necessities I needed immediately just to function. My parents, Roger and Denise Whitlow, stepped up initially in a way that genuinely meant a lot to me. They gave me an immediate $5,000 to cover emergency costs, and then, over the following months, we set up an arrangement where they'd contribute smaller amounts regularly, building toward what we all agreed to call my emergency fund, meant to rebuild a proper savings cushion I'd need going forward, since the fire had wiped out what little I'd managed to save previously. I want to be clear that I wasn't just sitting back expecting handouts. I was contributing too, putting away what I could from my own paycheck as a graphic designer, working extra freelance projects on the side specifically to rebuild faster. My parents' contributions were meant to supplement that effort, not replace it entirely, an arrangement that felt fair and reasonable to both sides at the time we set it up. About 7 months into this arrangement, with the fund sitting at just over $11,000, split roughly between what I'd contributed myself and what my parents had added, my mother sat me down and told me, with what seemed like genuine regret, that they needed to pause their contributions. "Things have gotten complicated," she said. "Your father's hours got cut back at work, and we just don't have the same flexibility right now. We're sorry, Cassandra. We know this isn't ideal timing." I asked how long the pause might last, whether this was something temporary or a permanent shift I needed to plan around. "We're just not sure yet," she said. "Let's revisit it in a few months and see where things stand." I believed her completely. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for understanding how blindsided I felt later. My father's job situation seemed plausible enough, and I didn't have any specific reason at the time to question the explanation, so I adjusted my own budget accordingly, scaled back my rebuilding timeline, and kept contributing what I could on my own, understanding that the fund's growth would just be slower than we'd originally planned. What I didn't know, what Palmer's comment at the wedding accidentally revealed months later, was that during those exact same months my parents claimed financial hardship, they'd been quietly funding an increasingly expensive wedding for my brother Theo and his fiancée Marina, contributions that apparently included, among other things, a $6,000 open bar that Palmer assumed I already knew about. But you need the family background first, or none of this actually lands the way it needs to. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the older of 2 kids. My brother Theo is 3 years younger than me, and growing up, there was always a subtle but persistent difference in how our parents treated us. One of those dynamics that's hard to point to specifically, but that you feel accumulating over years of small moments. Theo was more outgoing, more conventionally successful in the specific ways my parents seemed to value most: a good job in finance, an active social life, the kind of golden boy trajectory that got talked about constantly at family gatherings. I was quieter, more introspective, went into graphic design, which my parents always mentioned to relatives with a slightly apologetic edge, like it required some kind of justification. The fire happened during a period when I was already feeling somewhat peripheral in the family narrative, watching Theo's engagement to Marina unfold with tremendous fanfare just a few months before my own life quite literally went up in flames. I don't say that to diminish how genuinely happy I was for him, because I was, honestly. But there was an uncomfortable contrast, even then, between the excitement surrounding his upcoming wedding and the much quieter, more practical concern surrounding my own crisis. Theo and Marina's wedding planning ramped up significantly over the following year, right alongside my own slower, more careful rebuilding process. I heard about various wedding developments during family calls and gatherings, the venue they'd booked, the dress Marina had chosen, plans that all sounded lovely and, at the time, completely unconnected to my own financial situation. The wedding itself happened about 4 months after my parents told me they needed to pause their emergency fund contributions. I attended, genuinely happy to be there for my brother, no specific suspicion yet about any connection between the wedding's obvious lavishness and my own stalled financial support. That's when Palmer made his comment about the open bar. I remember standing there for a moment, drink in my own hand, feeling something shift uncomfortably in my stomach as I processed what he'd just said. $6,000, I repeated carefully. My parents paid for that? Palmer's face shifted slightly, some awareness dawning that he might have said something he wasn't supposed to. Yeah, I mean, that's what Theo told me, said his parents really wanted to go all out for the open bar specifically, insisted on covering it themselves, as like a wedding gift. Was that not something you knew about? I told him it was fine, that I'd just misunderstood some detail, and excused myself to the restroom, where I stood at the sink for several minutes trying to process what I'd just learned. $6,000 for an open bar alone, during the exact same period my parents claimed they couldn't afford to keep contributing to my emergency fund because of my father's reduced work hours. I didn't confront anyone at the wedding itself, obviously. That felt deeply inappropriate given the occasion, and honestly, I needed time to actually understand the full scope of what had happened before reacting to anything. But over the following week, I did some careful, quiet digging, mostly through conversations with relatives who'd been more directly involved in wedding planning logistics than I had been. What I pieced together was more extensive than just the open bar. My parents, it turned out, had contributed significantly to multiple aspects of the wedding: the venue deposit, a portion of Marina's dress, transportation for the wedding party, on top of the open bar Palmer had mentioned. The total, based on conversations with my Aunt Rosalind, who'd helped coordinate some of the vendor payments, came to somewhere around $18,000 in parental contributions toward Theo's wedding. $18,000 spent during the same period my own emergency fund contributions had supposedly paused due to financial hardship. I called my mother directly once I felt like I had enough information to actually have this conversation productively, rather than reacting purely out of the initial shock and hurt. "Mom, I need to ask you something," I said. "Palmer mentioned at the wedding that you and Dad paid for the open bar. $6,000. Is that true?" There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I already knew, before she even answered, that whatever explanation followed had been prepared for exactly this eventual question. "We wanted to do something special for Theo," she said finally. "Weddings are expensive, Cassandra, and we felt like it mattered to help make his day everything he and Marina wanted. You told me you couldn't keep contributing to my emergency fund because Dad's hours got cut," I said, my voice coming out flatter and more controlled than I actually felt in that moment. "But you had $18,000 available for Theo's wedding during those same months." Another pause. "It's not really the same situation," she said, her tone shifting slightly defensive now. "Weddings are one-time expenses. Your fund is more of an ongoing thing, and we just felt like the wedding took priority given the timeline involved." "My apartment burned down," I said. "I lost almost everything I owned. That felt like a priority too, Mom. You just decided Theo's open bar mattered more than helping me finish rebuilding my life." She didn't have a good response to that, not really, though she tried several different angles over the following minutes, none of which actually addressed the core issue, which was that they'd lied to me specifically about the reason for pausing my support, rather than being honest that they'd simply chosen to prioritize Theo's wedding instead. I called my father separately, hoping maybe he'd offer a more direct explanation, since he'd always seemed slightly less prone than my mother to elaborate justifications. Your mother and I talked about it, he admitted, sounding uncomfortable in a way that told me this wasn't a decision he was entirely proud of, even if he'd gone along with it. We knew Theo's wedding costs were adding up fast, and we made a choice about where to direct our available money. I know that probably doesn't feel great to hear, given everything you went through with the fire. You told me it was because your hours got cut, I said. That wasn't true, was it? He hesitated. My hours did get cut somewhat, he said. But we still had more flexibility than we let on. We should have been honest with you about the actual choice we were making, instead of letting you believe it was purely about our own financial limitations. I sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling something that was less pure anger and more a kind of deep, aching disappointment settle into my chest. It wasn't just that they'd chosen Theo's wedding over my emergency fund, which, while painful, might have felt more understandable if they'd simply been honest about the choice from the beginning. It was that they'd specifically constructed a false explanation, one designed to make the decision seem unavoidable rather than a genuine prioritization they'd consciously made. I want to walk you through the actual impact this had on my rebuilding process, because I think it matters for understanding why this wasn't just about hurt feelings, though obviously that was a significant part of it too. Without the ongoing contributions I'd been expecting, my rebuilding timeline had stretched out considerably longer than originally planned. I'd taken on additional freelance work, cutting into time I would have otherwise spent actually settling into my rebuilt life, working extra hours specifically trying to compensate for support I'd believed, based on their explanation, simply wasn't available anymore due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. Finding out that support had actually been available, just redirected toward my brother's wedding instead, based on a fabricated explanation, changed how I understood those months of extra strain entirely. It wasn't circumstances beyond anyone's control. It was a choice, made deliberately, and then hidden from me specifically so I wouldn't push back or feel entitled to question the decision. I decided, after about 2 weeks of sitting with everything, that I needed to have a direct, structured conversation with both my parents together, rather than continuing to process this piecemeal through separate phone calls that each seemed to reveal slightly more of the full picture. I sat down with them at their kitchen table, the same table where my mother had originally delivered the news about pausing contributions almost a year earlier. I need you to understand something, I told them, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage despite how much emotion was actually sitting underneath the surface. I'm not upset that you wanted to help with Theo's wedding. That's a reasonable thing for parents to want to do. What I'm upset about is that you lied to me, specifically, about why you couldn't keep helping me, rather than just being honest that you'd decided to prioritize his wedding instead. My mother tried, initially, to reframe the situation as less significant than I was making it out to be. We didn't think of it as lying exactly, she said. We just didn't want to make things more complicated by getting into the specifics of every financial decision we were making. You told me specifically that Dad's hours got cut, I said. That's not a vague generality, Mom. That's a specific, false explanation you constructed to avoid telling me the actual reason, which was that you'd chosen to spend $18,000 on Theo's wedding instead of continuing to help me rebuild after losing almost everything I owned. I told them what that fabricated explanation had actually cost me, the extra freelance hours, the delayed timeline, the months of believing I simply needed to accept reduced support because of circumstances outside anyone's control, when in reality, the money had simply been redirected somewhere they'd decided mattered more. My father, to his credit, seemed to genuinely absorb the weight of what I was describing, nodding slowly, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation had actually played out once it was laid out this plainly. My mother took longer to get there, still trying at various points to minimize the situation as an understandable, if perhaps poorly communicated, family decision, rather than the deliberate deception it actually represented. What do you want from us? She finally asked, some of her initial defensiveness finally starting to give way to something closer to genuine concern about where this conversation was actually heading. I told them what I'd decided, after those 2 weeks of processing everything and talking it through with a good friend who worked in family financial counseling, someone who'd helped me think clearly about what actually made sense given my specific situation. I wanted them to resume contributing to my emergency fund, at minimum matching what they would have contributed over those paused months, understanding that I wasn't asking for the full $18,000 they'd spent on Theo's wedding, since that money was genuinely gone at that point, spent on services already rendered. But I wanted a specific, concrete amount, something that acknowledged the actual gap their decision had created in my own rebuilding timeline. I also wanted, and this mattered more to me than the money itself if I'm honest, a genuine acknowledgement that what they'd done constituted deception, not just an unfortunate miscommunication, along with a commitment going forward to actually be honest with me about financial decisions that directly affected commitments they'd made to help me. My parents agreed to both conditions, though the conversation about the specific dollar amount took some genuinely uncomfortable back and forth over the following weeks. My mother in particular, still occasionally slipping into moments where she seemed to feel I was being unnecessarily harsh, given that, in her mind, helping with Theo's wedding had been a reasonable use of family resources, regardless of how it had been explained to me at the time. I didn't confront Theo directly right away, honestly, because I genuinely wasn't sure how much he actually knew about the connection between his wedding funding and my paused emergency fund contributions. I called him about 3 weeks after the initial confrontation with our parents, once I'd had enough time to think through how I actually wanted to approach that particular conversation. "I need to tell you something about how Mom and Dad funded your wedding," I said, and then walked him through the full situation, the fabricated explanation about Dad's hours, the actual redirection of funds that had been earmarked, at least informally, for helping me rebuild. Theo was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining everything. "I had no idea any of that was connected," he said finally, his voice sounding genuinely troubled. "I knew Mom and Dad were helping with some wedding costs, but I never thought to ask where that money was coming from, or whether it meant they were pulling back from helping you with the fire recovery." I should have asked more questions, honestly. I believed him, actually, hearing the specific quality of surprise and discomfort in his voice. I don't think Theo orchestrated any of this, or even fully understood, at the time, exactly what trade-off our parents were making behind the scenes to fund various aspects of his wedding. He'd simply accepted generous help from our parents, the way anyone getting married might, without necessarily digging into the specific source or broader context of where that generosity was actually coming from. "I want to help make this right somehow," he said. "Not because I think it was my fault exactly, but because I don't want you carrying the weight of a decision that got made without your knowledge, especially not after everything you already went through with the fire." That conversation, honestly, meant more to me than almost anything else that came out of this whole situation. Theo started contributing a modest but consistent amount to my emergency fund himself over the following months, an unprompted gesture that felt different from our parents' more negotiated, somewhat reluctant repayment plan. My parents' contribution came in the form of resumed monthly payments over the following year, gradually rebuilding what should have continued all along if they'd simply prioritized honesty over convenient deflection when they first decided to redirect that support toward Theo's wedding instead. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding how this all actually settled, rather than ending on some overly tidy note where everyone simply learned their lesson and moved forward seamlessly. My relationship with my mother, in particular, is still working through real damage from this situation. It's been about 8 months now since Palmer's offhand comment first blew everything open, and while things between us have improved somewhat from the initial tension, there's a wariness now that wasn't there before, a sense that I need to actually verify things independently now, rather than simply trusting that whatever explanation I'm given reflects the full, honest picture. My father and I have actually grown somewhat closer through this process, mostly because he was more willing than my mother to acknowledge directly, without much continued deflection, that the fabricated explanation had been genuinely wrong, regardless of how understandable the underlying desire to help with Theo's wedding might have been in isolation. Theo and I are closer now too, in a way that surprised me given how this whole situation started. Finding out the actual cost of his wedding funding, in ways he never intended or fully understood at the time, seemed to shift something in how he approaches family financial dynamics more broadly, more willing now to ask direct questions rather than simply accepting generous help without examining where it's actually coming from. My emergency fund, between my parents' resumed contributions and Theo's own additional support, is fully rebuilt now, sitting at just over $15,000. A meaningful cushion that finally reflects something closer to genuine security rather than the anxious, stretched thin feeling I'd been managing during those months when I believed, falsely, that reduced support simply reflected circumstances beyond anyone's control. Sometimes I think about Palmer, standing there at the wedding with his drink, having no idea whatsoever that his casual comment about the open bar was about to reveal something my parents had worked hard to keep hidden from me for almost a year. I think about how close I came to never actually knowing the truth, potentially just continuing to believe, indefinitely, that my parents' reduced support reflected genuine financial hardship rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize Theo's wedding instead. I don't know what would have happened if Palmer had never made that comment, whether I'd have eventually pieced together the truth some other way, or whether this might have simply remained one of those quiet family discrepancies that never fully surfaces, the kind everyone half senses but nobody actually confirms directly. But he did make that comment, and because of it, I got real accountability, both from my parents and from Theo, instead of continuing to carry an unnecessary financial burden based on a fabricated explanation designed specifically to prevent me from questioning a choice that was never actually mine to accept without complaint. That's really the whole story, when I look back on it clearly. Not some dramatic confrontation captured on camera, no screaming match that ended relationships permanently. Just an unguarded comment at a wedding reception, a family that decided a convenient lie was easier than an honest, difficult conversation about priorities, and a woman who had to learn, the hard way, that rebuilding your life sometimes means rebuilding your understanding of who you can actually rely on, too.